Namaskar, good evening. Let me begin by firstly thanking SPIPA and the Government of Gujarat as well as the Ahmedabad Management Association for coming together to arrange this lecture and also for inviting me to deliver the Atal Memorial Lecture this evening in Gandhinagar. I want to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Vyomesh Shah and his team who have accorded me such a warm welcome. I also want to acknowledge the presence of the President of the Ahmedabad Management Association, Shri Rajiv Bhai Gandhi, as also several other eminent past presidents and members of the AMA, such as Shri Mukesh Bhai Patel, Shri Divyesh Bhai Radia, and Shri Savan Bhai as well, and also Mr. Tomar, a distinguished police officer of the Gujarat cadre. So it's really wonderful to be back in my home, so to speak, because I was born in Ahmedabad. And though I'm from Rajkot, a true Kathiawadi, it is true that I also have very strong links with Ahmedabad, this great city of Gujarat, where Gandhinagar, of course, today is the state capital. Friends, thank you all for inviting me to deliver this lecture on the occasion of the 100th birth anniversary of Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Bharat Ratna Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee, under the Atal Sansmaran lecture series. It's also a great privilege for me to be here as a member of the high-level committee announced by the Ministry of Culture in August to commemorate the 100th birth anniversary of Vajpayee ji. And so I'm here partly acting out of delight at the invitation, but also partly I consider it my duty as a member of that committee to come here and say a few words to honor this great person. It would be very hard for anyone to do justice to the colossus that was Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee, even in a book, let alone a single lecture. And such was the multifaceted personality of this great statesman who strode the political stage for decades, both in and out of office. He, Vajpayee ji, was an extremely rare mix of an intellectual, poet, philosopher, and a politician as well. But one cannot decide whether he was a poet first or a politician first. And I think if one were to ask him, or if one were to look at his core personality, we would easily decide that he was essentially a poet. He never really allowed purely political considerations of power, position, and pelf to dictate his outlook. National interest, the well-being of the people of India and humanity at large, as well as peaceful coexistence, were at the heart of his policies. Vajpayee ji was a powerful orator. He was someone who was capable of capturing the imagination of his audience, mesmerizing his audience with the magic of his carefully selected words. Whether in Hindi or in English or in Urdu, he was equally at ease. And his words were not mere words, they conveyed deep meaning. They were full of potent thoughts and ideas and sentiments and emotions. He never gave offense to anyone at a personal level. His critique was always against an idea or thought or policy, but never against an individual. Even his opponents appreciated this. Even Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had recognized way back in the late 1950s the potential of a young Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and he had stated for the public record that Vajpayee ji was a leader to watch out for. As you all know, Vajpayee ji's parliamentary career began early, way back in the 1950s, and spanned over 5 decades. He was even as a budding leader, one of the most respected and enduring figures in Indian politics. He served as a member of parliament for 10 terms in the Lok Sabha. That itself is a very rare distinction and achievement. And 2 terms in the Rajya Sabha. First elected to the Lok Sabha in 1957 from Balrampur, Uttar Pradesh, and representing the Bharatiya Janasangh, that is the ideological precursor to the BJP, Vajpayee was always interested in issues related to India's national security. He had very strong views about the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty. He frequently criticized Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's foreign policy as being overly conciliatory and indecisive towards Pakistan, particularly on issues related to Kashmir, Tibet, and the boundary dispute with China. Barring the 2 years when he was the External Affairs Minister of India between 1977 and 1979, Vajpayee was an opposition MP for almost 40 years, right from 1957 onwards. Now, for the purpose of my talk today, I hope to cover 3 strands that can be discerned from Vajpayee's public speeches and policies, especially in the realm of defense, national security, and foreign policy. The first is the importance that he attached to the territorial integrity of India, Kshetriya Akhandta and Samprabhuta, sovereignty and territorial integrity. In his maiden speech of 15 May 1957, in the Lok Sabha debate on the President's address, Vajpayee lambasted and criticized Nehru's Kashmir policy. During this period, both as a member of the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, that is between 1957 and 1967, and as a parliamentary spokesperson of the Bharatiya Janasangh, Vajpayee made multiple speeches decrying Nehru's handling of Pakistan-related issues, including the then government's stance on the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War and the ongoing Kashmir issue, which had already flared up by then. Vajpayee, viewed Pakistan's actions as aggressive expansionism. He urged the full integration of Kashmir and also the rejection of any kind of UN-mediated solutions that legitimized the occupation by Pakistan of a part of Kashmir, which is what we now call Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Similarly, regarding the border incursions by China, which had already begun in the early 1950s and which manifested themselves quite severely by the late 1950s, he repeatedly urged the government to develop India's military capability and take serious note of Chinese actions. Ladies and gentlemen, he was among the first to also raise the issue of China's construction of the road through Aksai Chin, what we call G219, the highway that links Xinjiang with Tibet, which the Chinese had been surreptitiously and secretly constructing from roughly around 1953 onwards. He consistently urged the government to make efforts to recover the occupied territory of Aksai Chin, the entirety of it all. That is 38,000 square kilometers of Aksai Chin, which till today is in adverse possession. In June 1962, as tensions with China mounted, Vajpayee termed India's China policy as, and I quote him, ludicrously unrealistic and ineffective, unquote. He proposed that, as a realistic reorientation of India's China policy, India should first cut off diplomatic ties with China. Second, all diplomatic and defense policies and postures vis-à-vis China should clearly be directed towards the early recovery of lost territory. Third, conscious and concerted efforts should be made at international fora and in India's neighborhood to expose China's expansionist policies against India. Friends, contrary to the then Nehru government's position, Vajpayee called for the rapid development of infrastructure in the border regions as part of India's military preparedness. Strangely, at that time, the government of India had felt that it was not necessary to build infrastructure in the border areas, lest the adversary was able to use the same infrastructure to invade India more easily. But this was obviously not the correct way of thinking. Currently, the government of Prime Minister Modi has turned this particular thing on its head and is actively building border infrastructure so that India is able to better defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that's the right thing to do. Vajpayee also suggested establishing diplomatic relations with Taiwan, which called itself the so-called Republic of China and claimed to be the sole representative of all of China at that point of time. As we have seen, Vajpayee was unwilling to compromise on his views regarding the country's territorial integrity. This was evident from the strong positions he took against aggression committed by both Pakistan and China. His speeches in Parliament during the 65 Indo-Pakistan War emphasized the robust defense of Indian territory, particularly Kashmir, while pressurizing the government, even of Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri, to become more decisive in countering Pakistan's aggression. He at the same time did not hesitate to call for the opposition to unite and to rally behind the same government that he was criticizing. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to that particular aspect of his personality, we must credit him for being a nationalist first. That even as he criticized the then government's policies, he did not hesitate to back the same government when India was facing an external challenge during the 65 war. On the issue of Tibet, he urged the Indian government to actively support the Tibetan cause by virtue of the experience that India itself had had in its own struggle against imperialism and colonialism. So there was this groundswell of empathy that he had for the Tibetans because of India's own experience of having been colonized by an external power. In 1959, when the internal Khampa rebellion against Chinese occupation had reached its peak, with the Dalai Lama having to flee and seek refuge in India, Vajpayee criticized India's silence in the UN debate over Tibet in our own parliament. Highlighting Tibet's importance to India's security, he had urged the government not to accept Chinese claims on Tibet. It did not help matters, since the major powers, be it the United States of America, Great Britain, or any other power, including India, none of these powers had actually supported the Tibet cause, even when the Chinese PLA had first moved into Tibet to occupy it in October 1950. Now, in a sense, the kind of foresight that Vajpayee had also reminds us of the letter of 7 November 1950 that Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel had written to Pandit Nehru, warning him of the potential consequences of a power like China having moved into Tibet for the first time in history, making China for the first time in history a direct neighbor of India. That letter in SPIPA especially, I would recommend that everyone should read Sardar Patel's letter of 7 November 1950. And Vajpayee, like Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, was also talking about those same security implications of a new presence in the neighborhood. Vajpayee was far-sighted about the adverse implications of the People's Republic of China replacing Taiwan. At that time, it called itself the so-called Republic of China, replacing Taiwan as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. There was a debate raging in the 1950s whether the newly found People's Republic of China should be given that seat, which was then occupied by Taiwan, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And criticizing the government position that membership of the UN could temper the aggressive tendencies of the People's Republic of China, which was something that the then Indian government was stating that membership of the UN, membership of the UN Security Council might temper the People's Republic of China's aggressive tendencies. Vajpayee did not agree with that logic. In fact, he had views that were contrary. He had pointed out that Beijing could well use the veto and its diplomatic influence to thwart India's policy objectives and disseminate unfavorable narratives about India if it were to be a member of the UN. Now, in hindsight, one can say that Vajpayee's apprehensions were well justified. As the unfolding events of succeeding decades revealed after Beijing replaced Taipei in the UN Security Council in 1971, we have seen for ourselves that China thereafter held up for a while recognition of newly independent Bangladesh and later continued its support for self-determination for Jammu and Kashmir on the basis of the so-called UN Security Council resolutions. China's veto power has continued to dog India's interests since then. The most recent examples are China's blocking of the listing of Pakistan-based terrorist networks and individuals under the relevant provisions of the UN Security Council, and also the dilution of references to the resistant front in the UN Security Council statement of 25 April 2025, which condemned the Pahalgam terrorist attack. It is clear that in his early years as a parliamentarian, Shri Vajpayee emerged as a hardcore realist. Later, one can say that he veered towards greater pragmatism, but without abandoning his core beliefs about sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national interest. The second aspect, ladies and gentlemen, that I wish to highlight is that Vajpayee was not averse or against building upon the nuclear program that had been carried out for years by previous governments to strengthen India's national security. He was ready to build on the efforts made by previous governments. Vajpayee was always of the opinion that India should possess nuclear weapons. When he got a chance as Prime Minister to carry out nuclear tests in 1998, he magnanimously presented it as a continuation of the policies set into motion by the previous administrations. He gave them credit. It is well known that Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao, as Prime Minister, had virtually decided to carry out India's nuclear tests, but was forced to withhold action at the last minute due to US pressure. According to Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, who was later the Honorable President of India, in May 1996, the then Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao had asked him, that is Shri Abdul Kalam, Dr. Abdul Kalam, to prepare for conducting nuclear tests. However, when the Congress government fell in the 1996 election, Shri Rao asked Shri Abdul Kalam to share details with Vajpayee. According to Vajpayee's media advisor, Shri Ashok Tandon's book, The Reverse Swing, at the swearing-in ceremony when Vajpayee succeeded Rao in 1996, Shri Rao quietly passed him a chit that said, and I quote, "Now is the time to accomplish my unfinished task," unquote. The implied meaning was that this unfinished task was the nuclear test plan at Pokhran. However, Shri Vajpayee's government in 1996, as you all know, was a short-lived one, survived only 13 days, and therefore Vajpayee had to wait for some more time till he returned to power. He then put his plan into action shortly after being returned to office for the second time in 1998. The rest, of course, is history. Shri Vajpayee had always wanted India to have nuclear weapons, as I said, and he believed that peace lay in having strength. Being a strong power was a reason why you would be able to actually support peace. And without strength, you could not negotiate peace. During discussions in the Rajya Sabha on the 22nd of December 1964, Vajpayee had raised the issue of nuclear tests carried out by China. China had, as you all know, carried out its nuclear tests in October 1964. Vajpayee had urged the government to discuss the issue of India developing its nuclear bomb with an open mind. He presented an example of the US dropping an atomic bomb on non-nuclear Japan in 1945, asserting that had Japan possessed nuclear weapons, the US would not have dared to use an atomic bomb against Japan. Vajpayee had predicted that China's possession of a nuclear bomb would change the military balance of the region to the detriment of India's interests. In hindsight, reveals that there was wisdom and logic in what he had said. It was in this context that despite being on the opposition benches, Vajpayee had welcomed India's peaceful nuclear explosion on 18 May 1974, which was conducted by the government of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. But Vajpayee had supported that because it was in the national interest. He decisively ensured that his words became a reality, as I said before, when he took office again as Prime Minister in 1998. But this time around, he was not only determined to test India's nuclear weapons, but also to resist any global pressure that was mounted on India to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the NPT and the CTBT. He strongly resisted that. For Vajpayee, the development of nuclear technology was a matter of self-reliance, what we now call Atmanirbharta. He firmly believed that the possession of nuclear weapons would enhance India's strategic autonomy as well as deterrence capability. In 1998, as you all know, India was facing a harsh external environment. The China-Pakistan nexus in missile production and in the nuclear domain was at its peak. And the US was deliberately ignoring these developments. This is the context in which Vajpayee took that momentous decision to conduct 3 nuclear tests, underground nuclear tests on the 11th of May 1998, followed by 2 underground tests on the 13th of May 1998. And he declared that the decision was, and I quote him, based on the same policy tenets that guided India for 5 decades, due to an underlying national consensus. So this shows that Vajpayee also believed in building national consensus on important issues and also supporting the national consensus built by others, regardless of whether he was in office or in opposition. The third dimension of interest to us is Vajpayee's pragmatic realism. While the decision to undergo and carry out tests was driven by realistic security considerations, the decision to impose a self-imposed moratorium on further testing reflected his pragmatism. Having carried out India's nuclear tests, India was quick to say that India will not test any further and that we impose upon ourselves this credible minimum nuclear deterrence policy. So we will not test anymore. Similarly, during the 1971 war, Vajpayee transcended partisan politics and party lines and extended full support to the then government of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. This shows that Vajpayee valued nationalism and he prioritized national unity over opposition politics. Earlier too, when we go back in history, we find that as the External Affairs Minister of India in the Janata Party government under Shri Morarji Desai, in 1977, Vajpayee, the realist, had tempered his strong views about China and Pakistan. When he took over as the External Affairs Minister of India, he moderated his views towards these 2 nations that were otherwise seen as India's adversaries. Vajpayee is also remembered today, not only for his firm stand against Pakistan and China, but also for his peace overtures to both these countries at that time. In 1978, many of you may recall that Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee became the first Indian Foreign Minister to visit Pakistan in over a decade. Meeting with General Ziaul Haq amid the latter's military rule, General Ziaul Haq was then the military dictator of Pakistan, and yet Shri Vajpayee had, as foreign minister, reached out to him and met him as well. Vajpayee's agenda was normalization. He pushed for enhanced trade, cultural exchanges and people-to-people ties, famously proposing later that there should be a bus service between Delhi and Lahore. Now this is a vision that he had even as far back as in 1978, but he was able to put it into practice only much later when he became the Prime Minister. But he had spoken about a bus service even in 1978. As the External Affairs Minister, he also welcomed normalization of diplomatic ties with China. In an effort to revive high-level political contacts with China, Shri Vajpayee visited that country in February 1979 as Foreign Minister of India. Reportedly, in his meeting with the then Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders, Vajpayee conveyed to them that the boundary issue, the boundary dispute, could be put on the back burner and that the two countries could focus on improving exchanges in other areas such as trade. He was a very practical man as well. The two sides had agreed during that visit of Shri Vajpayee in 1979 to develop bilateral relations while continuing the dialogue to resolve the boundary issue. Though he raised serious security issues with the Chinese side, such as China's support to Pakistan on Kashmir and its assistance to the Naga rebels as well, he also sought better relations with Beijing by keeping bilateral ties grounded in pragmatism and mutually beneficial cooperation. So this phase, Vajpayee's phase as External Affairs Minister between 1977 and 1979, revealed what I would like to call the Vajpayee brand of diplomacy. As External Affairs Minister, he blended idealism with realism. He emphasized that it was not possible to change geography and choose neighbors. That was not possible in any case. And therefore, he also advocated dialogue to resolve bilateral issues. Similarly, as Prime Minister between 1998 and 2004, Shri Vajpayee once again took a number of steps to normalize ties with Pakistan and China. After the nuclear tests at Pokhran in 1998, Vajpayee resorted to normalizing relations with Pakistan, and during the 1999 Lahore Bus Yatra, when he travelled to Pakistan, he signed the Lahore Declaration with then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, in which the two sides committed to implementing the Shimla Agreement in letter and spirit to reduce the risk of accidental or unauthorized use of nuclear weapons and also to resolve all issues, including the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. Tragically and sadly, regrettably, this olive branch was betrayed by Pakistan's Kargil intrusion in 1999. Vajpayee responded decisively, authorizing military eviction but refraining from allowing our armed forces, our very capable and competent armed forces, from crossing the line of control. This showcased calibrated escalation. He was willing to take firm action against the intruders, but he also directed the armed forces not to cross the line of control, which also meant that India's moral ground would be more credible to the rest of the world. On morality, we came out on top straight away by not crossing the LOC. Even during Operation Parakram, which was that huge military mobilization of troops which was conducted in the immediate aftermath of the attack on the Indian Parliament, again it was Vajpayee's restraint that prevented an all-out war. So while we demonstrated to Pakistan our capabilities, we did not actually go to war because Vajpayee also was acting as that restraining force. Now, as regards China, you all know that as Prime Minister, he visited that country again in June 2003, this time as Prime Minister. And until then, China had a long-standing policy of showing Sikkim as a separate country. It had never formally accepted Sikkim's merger with India in 1975. During his term as Prime Minister, Vajpayee convinced China to recognize Sikkim as an integral part of India and to reprint its maps accordingly. Finally, a Chinese Premier, that is Prime Minister Vajpayee, announced that Sikkim is an integral part of India during his visit to India in April 2005. Though it is a fact that by then the NDA government in Delhi had been replaced by the UPA. China's map showing Sikkim as a part of India was finally handed over. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I was the Consul General of India during Prime Minister's visit to Shanghai. And I can tell you that that visit was very successful. Prime Minister's visit to China, particularly to Shanghai, it also catalyzed a rapid rise in bilateral trade and investment. The period between 2000 and 2005 one can describe as a golden period in India-China trade and economic relations. And it was a very optimistic period for our ties with almost all the major Indian IT companies, our pharmaceutical companies, and even some manufacturing giants actually investing in China and hoping to do well. Some did well, some did not do too well, but that is a separate issue. Notably, during his 2003 visit to Shanghai, Prime Minister Vajpayee addressed the first ever conference on information technology in Shanghai, and he called for a strategic alliance between Indian and Chinese IT companies to combine their respective strengths. Now today, this appears idealistic given the nature of relations between India and China, and given the several areas of friction that we have, even though there is currently a thaw underway. I say that there is a thaw underway because less than 10 days ago, I myself was asked to lead the high-level Track 2 dialogue to China to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties. And I can tell you that the atmosphere has greatly changed for the better, but we have to take one step at a time. The fact of the matter is that today China is also offering AI cooperation with India. So it may appear a little idealistic, but we should look out for any opportunity that presents itself to us to improve our own position insofar as critical supply chains are concerned or artificial intelligence is concerned. An important aspect, ladies and gentlemen, of the China visit was the decision to fast-track talks on the boundary dispute by initiating the framework of special representatives of the two prime ministers. As you all know, Shri Ajit Doval is currently not only the National Security Advisor of India, but he is also the special representative for the India-China boundary talks. Incidentally, the gentleman who led the Chinese delegation when I went a week or so ago as head of the Indian delegation was none other than His Excellency Mr. Taiping Kuo, the former special representative of China, who had dialogued with at least 4 of our NSAs, beginning with Sri Rajesh Mishra, Sri Jay Dikshit, Sri N.K. Narayanan, and finally Sri Shiv Shankar Menon. And I do feel that the SR level dialogue, as we call it, the special representative dialogue, that mechanism which has survived, has contributed, along with other dialogue mechanisms, to the recent disengagement that we have seen in the India-China border areas, and also the reduction in tensions that we have seen along the border. After the Kalwan incident of June 2020, you are aware that the bilateral relationship had fallen into a huge trough. It had deteriorated rapidly. There was almost no conversation or contact, but things are opening gradually now. With China, the direct flights have just started from Kolkata a couple of days ago to Guangzhou. It is pertinent to note that the exercise of clarifying and confirming the line of actual control on the basis of the bilateral border agreements of 1993 and 1996, these acquired salience after Vajpayee was elected as PM for the 3rd time in 1999. I was the then head of the Indian side of the India-China expert group. It's called the Expert Group of Diplomatic and Military Officials from 1996 to 2000 as the chief negotiator, I could see the kind of interest the government of Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee was taking in the matter of clarification and confirmation of the line of actual control. The Chinese side and I were then engaged in exchanging maps for the middle sector, which has relatively smaller differences between India and China, and we successfully exchanged the map while I was still in Delhi as Director China. I remember in 2000 we exchanged informally the map for the middle sector. The formal exchange took place 2 years later in 2002. But ironically, after having exchanged the map clarifying and confirming each other's position on the line of actual control in the middle sector, the Chinese did not agree to carry out the same exercise for the eastern and western sectors, that is Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh, obviously claiming that the issues there were far more complex, the differences are far more magnified, and the territory involved is far greater. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say that Vajpayee ji had great foresight. He visualized India as a great power long before its economic growth rates made this a realistic possibility. Today, we can say with conviction that India is a great power or on its way to becoming a great power because we are the fourth largest economy in the world, soon to be the third largest, and we have overtaken a number of major countries, including European countries, including members of the UN Security Council, and therefore this is definitely a possibility today. But Vajpayee ji had spoken about India being a great power even then. Such was his firm conviction in the future of India. He said that he could not imagine that any future paradigms or arrangements for security in the region can be effective if it does not include India. He saw India's security, stability and prosperity as central to the security, stability, democracy and prosperity of all of Asia. He wanted an Asia where power does not threaten stability and security. These are his words. He rejected an Asia in which some countries would dominate and crowd out the others. Now in today's language, today's parlance, we can say that Vajpayee ji was also seeking a multipolar Asia. His vision was prophetic. Today the world recognizes that India is indispensable for having a rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific. In a sense, Vajpayee ji was also the architect of the close strategic partnership between India and the US following the end of the Cold War. Vajpayee ji was clear, though he did not articulate it directly, that India must not only engage the United States, but should move away from the beaten path and forge good relations. Now, despite severe US sanctions imposed on India by the United States after the Pokhran II nuclear tests, Vajpayee ji started the nuclear dialogue with the US. He surprised Washington by coupling his nuclear defiance on the one hand with the declaration that India and the United States were natural allies. That shows the sophistication of his diplomacy as well. And you'll all remember that in June 1998, Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee sent veteran politician Shri Jaswant Singh to New York and Washington to explain India's strategic motives for conducting the tests and to also assess the situation in general. How can we move forward in our relations with the US? From 11 June 1998, diplomatic negotiations commenced. Shortly, within 1 month after our nuclear test, negotiations with the US had already started. The Indian side was then represented by Shri Jaswant Singh, who had become the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, and later he was also the External Affairs Minister of India. And the US side was led by Mr. Strobe Talbot, the Deputy Secretary of State. By 2000, mind you, the tension generated by the Pokhran tests had eased. Such was the diplomacy conducted by Shri Vajpayee and his team. All this resulted in the first US presidential visit after 22 years to India. That is the visit of President Bill Clinton. His visit was the first since Jimmy Carter's visit to India in 1978. And it took place within less than 2 years of India's nuclear tests. In 2004, India and the United States decided to sign the what is called the Next Steps in Strategic Partnership Agreement. That agreement was heralded, described as a breakthrough in India-US strategic collaboration because it committed both countries to working together in 4 difficult areas. 1. Civil nuclear energy. 2. Civilian space program. 3. High technology trade. And 4. Missile defense. Where India's possession of nuclear weaponry had previously made any meaningful cooperation with the United States all but impossible. In such an impossible situation, he had got the United States to agree to cooperation in 4 critical areas. All said and done, one can say that the recent challenges that have surfaced between India and the United States because of the arbitrary Trump tariffs do not detract from the longer-term vision that continues to exist of close and cooperative ties between the 2 democracies. It's very important to have good relations between India and the US at all times, though not on arbitrary terms. And that is why India is demonstrating its strategic autonomy and its resolve not to accept any arbitrary imposition of conditions. Ladies and gentlemen, as I stated before, it's not easy to do justice to the myriad and multiple achievements of Sri Vajpayee in a short lecture. I wish to end my remarks by mentioning some notable aspects that remain relevant even today as India navigates a world in flux, characterized by major power conflict, by great uncertainty all around, and the weaponization of trade and technology. The first such concept that is relevant even today and that links the Vajpayee period with the current period is the idea of self-reliance or Atmanirbharta, which I referred to in the course of my lecture. Sri Vajpayee wanted India to strive for self-sufficiency in the strategic domain, as evident in his address to the nation following the test firing of the Agni-2 missile in 1999. In another address at the 24th conference of DRDO scientists on 6 August 1999, Vajpayee ji had congratulated the DRDO for the indigenous development of a spectrum of missiles, electronics, aircraft, tanks, armaments, and ship-related technologies, among others. So this shows us that Vajpayee ji firmly believed that the indigenous development of science and technology, and particularly Atmanirbharta in defense manufacturing, would help the country overcome challenges of technology denials or control regimes or export controls, etc., that were imposed or enforced on India by the West, by the developed world. Vajpayee ji also decisively directed the Kargil war, mind you, under a nuclear overhang. He unleashed the full might of the Indian armed forces on the including Pakistani forces in 1999, even though both countries by then were declared nuclear weapon states. He called the Pakistani bluff without difficulty. And coming to the present, we have seen that Prime Minister Modi too decisively used the Indian armed forces to carry out what you call cross-border strikes in 2016 and in 2019, and more recently during Operation Sindoor after the Pahalgam terrorist attack, despite Pakistan's bluff about possessing nuclear weapons. So that is a great similarity that I see between these 2 great leaders. In fact, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's approach has evolved. It is even more decisive, it is even more forceful. From conducting cross-border surgical strikes by special forces in 2016 to using the Indian Air Force to bomb a terrorist target in Balakot deep inside Pakistan in 2019, India's Operation Sindoor has a new doctrine which has set a new benchmark for the first time in history. Prime Minister Vajpayee was clear, as I mentioned before, that the Indian military would not cross the line of control in Kargil. India's doctrine today of carrying out punitive missions against terrorist infrastructure well inside Pakistan is an even stronger affirmation of India's resolve, and it is here to stay. So we are no longer talking about not crossing the line of control. We are in fact announcing to the world that we will cross that line and we will hit you wherever you are, and we will, chase you to the end of the earth if need be, if there are terrorist attacks. And that's why I say that Prime Minister Modi's policy is an evolution of some of those policies of the Vajpayee era, but with an even stronger emphasis and greater resolve. In fact, the new normal which is now in place since Operation Sindoor considers terrorists, Pakistan-based terrorists, as well as their supporters in Pakistan, including potentially the Pakistani armed forces, as legitimate targets. They will also be targeted under the new normal. At the same time, Prime Minister Modi, like Sri Vajpayee before him, has also shown a remarkable desire for regional peace and stability, and strong belief in Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, Sabka Prayas for the entire region as well. You are all aware that he reached out to Pakistan soon after taking office in 2014. In fact, he invited then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to his oath-taking ceremony along with other South Asian leaders. In December 2015, like Vajpayee ji before him in 1999, Prime Minister Modi visited Lahore to promote peace. Like Vajpayee ji, he too was let down by Pakistan. Vajpayee ji's strong commitment to sovereignty and territorial integrity is also reflected today in decisions taken by the NDA-2 government. The Modi government has fulfilled a long-standing commitment to India's sovereignty and territorial integrity by revoking Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. This was done, as you are all aware, in August 2019. This has enabled Kashmir to become part of the mainstream of national progress. Moreover, the NDA-2 government has shown firm commitment all along to the recovery of India's territories that are under adverse possession, be they in Aksai Chin or in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, or for that matter in the Trans-Karakoram tract of Shaksgam, which was illegally handed over by Pakistan to China as part of their so-called boundary agreement of March 1963. Ladies and gentlemen, it may be recalled that Home Minister Shri Amit Shah had categorically stated in Parliament in August 2019 that Jammu and Kashmir includes Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and Aksai Chin as part of its territorial boundaries, and that these claims can never be abandoned. To end, I wish to say that though Sri Vajpayee is no longer with us, his thoughts and policies continue to guide India's contemporary outlook, whether it is in regard to defense, security or foreign policy. India's quest for multipolarity and its strategic autonomy, they carry echoes of the Vajpayee era. Shri Vajpayee's contribution to India's progress in the social, economic, scientific and security realms will forever be remembered by a grateful nation. Thank you. Jai Hind. I bargained for, but I thought I should try and do justice to not just the topic but to the great man himself.